Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this program. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is a Wednesday. It is the 22nd day of January, and I know some of you this doesn't apply to, but most of you, I think it does. It's cold, and it's beautiful overhead, and with all this fresh snow on the ground, it's so clean and so quiet and so pretty. But it won't take but another day or two, and it's just going to be. And then you just want it to get. That's when it's, we get puddles and all that. But it looks like we're going to have cold weather long enough that there's not going to be a whole lot of melt. So, but anyway, we will survive. We've done it before, and we'll do it again. And it is beautiful. And I think we constantly have to remind ourselves of that because, sometimes we become so busy that we just everything that gets in the way and seems to be keeping us from what we believe to be our priorities is something we'd rather get out of the way. But when you think about it and you look at it, people that don't have it are really missing something. I keep telling myself that, hoping that eventually I'll believe it. But seriously, it is beautiful, and it is a wonderful day to be here at the Virtual Center with you. I appreciate the opportunity. I appreciate your trust in sacrificing in some of your time, and I know it's valuable to a program like this. I appreciate it so very, very much. We do encourage you to give us a call and react to some of the issues that we're discussing here at the Virtual Center. We had a caller yesterday, if you remember. We had a call, Michael, and it was just one of the better calls we've gotten in a long time. It was just great. And I know that some of this information and some of the perspectives and are things that strike you in ways where you feel like you have something to say, but maybe you're not sure whether other people are going to feel the same way about it you do or to think it's as important as you do. Let me ask you to not worry about that because I've absolutely, in the 8 months or however long we've been doing the Virtual Center here, I can't remember one call we've made that wasn't more than worthwhile for people to hear. So don't even give it a second thought. We would love to hear from you. Our email address, our phone number is area code 304-658-3333. I'm jumping ahead to my email address first. But the phone number, that's what we're talking about, 304-658-3333. My email address, if you'd like to communicate with me directly, I would love to hear from you. My email is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. One of the things that struck me after yesterday's program, I have the article by Anna Marie Cox, which is kind of what we looked at the close of the program yesterday. And we were looking at this article, and let me just, as an aside, make a comment that one of the things that my association with something like the Virtual Center is doing, it is keeping me up on my reading. I'm reading an incredible amount, and I love it, and I always love to do it. And there's something unforgiving about a 2-hour program that's coming up in 2 or 3 hours or whatever. So even sometimes if you'd like to say, I don't feel like reading today. Fact of the matter is, once you get into it and once you do start to read, especially things that really excite the gray matter and cause you to think and react or whatever, good stuff. There's nothing like it. And I'm so appreciative of the opportunity to be here on a regular basis and to share these thoughts with you. again, I have to keep pinching myself and telling myself that, I must be careful to not convey the idea that everything that I say here during the 2-hour period are things that I particularly agree with. I say that because I'm citing so much literature, not only related to the founders. We've done an awful lot of that, and of course we'll continue to do it. But some of the information that's coming out on some of the topics that we're dealing with that are indeed related to the whole issue of constitutionalism in America. And I'm citing this, that, and the other thing, and it doesn't necessarily follow that because I cite it, that means that I particularly endorse it or agree with it or anything else. In fact, quite the opposite. Much of the material that I want to share with you presents a position or an interpretation or a perspective that I may not necessarily agree with at all. And that's the point. Basically, I would suggest no way do I ever want this opportunity to deteriorate into a situation where all we're talking about is the same kinds of things with the same kind of perspective in order to reinforce things that we kind of believe going in anyway. I don't believe that. I find it to be extremely dangerous. When I hear people tell me that they don't watch anything else but Fox News, I shiver. But I do the same thing if people tell me the same kind of thing with something like MSNBC. In fact, if we could take the people that watch nothing but Fox News and ask them to watch MSNBC for a week and do it the other way around, I think the results might be very, very interesting. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen enough. People don't do that of their own free choice. And consequently, what we end up doing, too many of us, are reading the things that kind of go along with what we already believe. And what we're looking to do is reinforce things we already believe. And again, I think we have to confront points of view and issues that we don't necessarily agree with. And that's why I think, especially when we're dealing with history, going back looking at some of the primary sources, I'm not going to make a decision or take a position and say, I don't agree with Thomas Jefferson or I don't agree with James Madison. I so respect the insight that these people bring to issues that whether in fact their position on a particular issue agrees with mine or not is not really the point. The point is, if you read enough and get to appreciate the range and the depth with which these guys read and thought, you can't do anything else but appreciate it. So again, I would love to hear from you. Again, area code 304-658-3333, and my email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. Last evening, when the program was ended, as I started to say a few moments ago, one of the things that struck me, I mentioned that I'm trying to get through this book called Who Owns the Future, and we talked quite a bit about it yesterday. In fact, I took the Aristotle quote, if you remember, in our second hour yesterday, directly from that book. And one of the things that I neglected to mention, I haven't read, I'm only not even a third of the way through the book. I would say probably 10-15%. And I hope to do quite a bit better. I'm going to be kind of snowed in for the rest of the week, along with a lot of you. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to get some time to do some serious reading and make some progress in this book, because I do think it is quite important. But one of the things that struck me about Lanier's book, and it's one of the comments he makes, and I can't remember exactly. If I could, I would go back and cite the page. That's one of the disadvantages of Kindle, it seems to me, is you're not dealing with the same page structure as you are in a hard copy of the book. And so, you almost have to thumb your way, just go back page by page and hope that the thing jumps out at you. But anyway, one of the things that struck me last evening, and I had neglected to mention it when we were on the air, is the idea of those people, just recognizing that while there are many, many people that are very, very concerned, obviously I'm one, about this threat to our privacy and security, and the extent to which our inclination and willingness to give away so much information about ourselves, many times unknowingly. And again, I'm not criticizing anybody for that, because in today's society, you almost can't do anything else. But the fact of the matter is, while there are many, many people who are very concerned about this, and I think we looked at a few, Ina Marie Cox and some of the other pieces of literature that we've looked at over the last couple of programs. But it's important to recognize that there are a lot of people, and many of them probably could be classified in the area of geeks, of people that are living in this revolution, this digital revolution that we're in the midst of, who are very, very supporters of it and trust it and believe in it. And it's important to recognize that that's true. There has traditionally been in our history, we have a history of people who have regularly believed, who regularly surface and believe that while science and technology create problems, a number of problems for our society at any particular point in time, the fact of the matter is many of the problems that technology causes, further technology can resolve. And many people have a tremendous faith in the fact that this is true and that this will happen. And what I'm saying is that many people who see the tremendous emphasis on information and the degree to which digital networking and all the things that we talked about yesterday are dependent on the quest for information from people whose privacy is clearly, I was going to say being compromised, but in fact it's probably more than that, and that really concerns me too. But they believe very, very firmly that in the end all of this is going to work out for the better. And Lanier in his book makes reference to this very fact. And the fact that he has a background in Silicon Valley, and he's worked with, and he's sold ideas to Google and some other of these large networking operations and organizations. He makes the point of saying that for a long time he was one of the supporters, and it was only after quite some time that he began to recognize the negatives of this. And he became very sensitive to it, and very concerned about it, and that's what prompts him to write this book. So, in a sense, what makes the book valuable is not only the fact that he was on the inside, so to speak. He's got tremendous experience. He knows what he's talking about. He knows this business. He knows where these kinds of things came from and where they are headed and what the purpose is and all the rest of it. So he's speaking as an authority. And I think that's very, very important to keep in mind. It's very difficult not to take seriously some of the things that he says, because he's been there and he knows what he's talking about. And I think you recognize that very quickly. I did. And one of the things that he points out is that many of the people that he's worked with in Silicon Valley, many of the people that are totally enthralled with the magic of technology and data collection and data manipulation, really believe that ultimately the problems that it can solve will far outweigh the dangers that it seems to be causing in the short term. They believe that. And one of the things that I picked up on, I believe I did, I think I perceived it, and I thought it was so ironic, is that there's an element of Karl Marx that jumps out at you as you read this stuff. I meant to mention this yesterday and I didn't, but better late than never, I guess. But if you remember just quickly about Marx's Communist Manifesto, Marx believed, of course, this is the idealism of Karl Marx. This is what critics will constantly try to put to doubt, that Marx was so idealistic and unrealistic that what he's proposing actually couldn't happen. And some people are, in fact, so cynical they basically will say, and Marx probably really knew that this was for public consumption, they believe. But what Marx predicted was, with the idea of the power of the state and the need for the state to eliminate all vestiges of competition and self-interest and all of that in society, to the point that you really turn society into a situation where everybody is looking at the same set of priorities, looking at the same goals, and agreeing, working together on implementing the strategies necessary to reach those goals. Marx's idealism, of course, is in the fact that ultimately, once this process has been completed, once all vestiges of self-interest and the profit motive and all of these things are eliminated, and once people's priorities have been focused on the right things, which is concern for the community and the idea that if the community prospers, we'll all prosper with it, and all the rest of it. Marx basically argues that at that point, when there's no real need anymore for the state, and so consequently, at some point in the process, the state will wither away, and we will indeed have what Marx called a state of pure communism, where ultimately people, the ideal being that people can get along and live together because they all have the same priorities, and there's nobody involved that's trying to gain advantage over anybody else or anything else. That everybody would accept the idea that everybody has to be guaranteed enough to survive on and be comfortable on and have a meaningful quality of life and all of that. And once everybody agrees on that and is willing to work together towards achieving it, then Marx's argument is that there's really no need anymore for the state. It's extremely idealistic, and that's probably the basis of a lot of the criticism of Marx. In reality, you pick up that same idea in reading Lanier's book. It's very clear that many of these people that are involved, that are well placed in many of these digital networks, who are engaged in the process of data collection and data manipulation, they really believe that while there might be short-term problems and short-term negatives, in the long run, all of this is going to work out for the best, because at some point in time, there's not going to be any more need for, we'll have all we need to resolve all of our problems. And that ultimately we'll have reached nirvana, so to speak. And it's extremely idealistic. And it makes, to me, it made perfect sense that people that are so into this process, into technology and what it can do, would probably believe just something like that. The idea that the very things that they are involved in are the solutions to the problems which we can't even define yet. And that ultimately they'll reach a point when not only do we have basically a constant continuous flow of the information that we need in order to generate the so-called metadata, but technology will also have reached the point where these machines will have become so intelligent that they'll be able to see patterns and trends and things that we humans can't see, because there's just so much data There's no way in the world that the human mind can even conceptualize that we could handle that much information and organize it in the kind of ways that technology is going to make it possible for us to do. And rather than being something that is a tremendous threat, many of these people believe that this is a goal that we ought to strive to achieve. And the irony of the whole thing, to me, is the fact that it smacks of Marx. And if you said that to these people, they would be shocked. But in effect, that's what that's in many ways what they're talking about. And I think it's a fascinating idea. It's something that struck me as I was reading, and I kind of made a little note to myself, mental note to myself, to mention it because I thought it was really interesting. And I haven't gone far enough in the book to be able to examine this in any more depth. So I don't know whether Lanier returns to this or not, but it's something that I've noticed early on in the book, in the very first part. I've gone about 3 or 4 chapters, I think, in the book, and it's one of the things that struck me and as being potentially quite significant. Anyway, I have before me a copy of Anna Maria Cox's article that we closed yesterday's program with, and I just kind of wanted to touch on her conclusions again in order to kind of bring us back to where we were, so we can move on into yet another facet of this. And of course, what she's talking about is that there's evidence, there's a lot of evidence that those people who are being asked are in many cases quite concerned about the fact that corporations, private entities are collecting and selling information about us, oftentimes without their permission. And I ask you to just note, and again, I'm not going to take any time on it, but I noticed this the other day. It occurred with me. Every once in a while, when you get a monthly bill from some organization or credit card company or something like that, there will be an insert in there where periodically these organizations send you their policy on privacy and information and what they do and what they feel that they have a right to exchange with others and pass on, and what they feel like they don't. And they try to do this to put customers at ease. But I would suggest to you that usually it's one of those things. It's usually a folded 4-pager with print font that is so small that you almost need a microscope to read it. And when I see something like that, I become a little bit uncomfortable. But Anna Marie Cox makes the point that 71% of those polled, I think I mentioned this yesterday, say that they are very concerned about, quote, companies selling or sharing their information about them without their permission. But again, I think that one of the things that we touched upon yesterday, which I think is very significant, are the concluding comments that Anna Maria Cox makes about this whole process. And this is where we left the program yesterday, so I kind of wanted to return to it and pick up before we went on. She says citizens are supposed to be comforted by the data, comforted that the data is in some huge impersonal block of numbers. It's not data, it's metadata. And that's supposed to be, that's a relief. The problem with mass data collection, she says, isn't that those who have it can find out about any one individual's private life. It's that if you have enough data, you don't have to find out about one individual's life. In other words, what you're looking for are ways to organize the data in such a way that you're finding common traits and you're grouping people with the same characteristics. And the only way to know that is to have access to this kind of data. So in a sense, what she's agreeing with is that most of these organizations aren't after your personal information unless they're out there trying to steal your PIN numbers or something. But generally, most of these organizations aren't after your personal information. They could care less. But what they're after is the generation of the kinds of data that they get from you that they can share with data that they get from other people in order to find out basically what your priorities are, especially in terms of selling their product, whatever it happened to be. She says marketers have learned that more quickly than the government. In other words, the private collectors of data are running way ahead of the government in terms of the realizations of some of these things. Foot dragging about do not track aside. Commercial interests don't want to know about you. They want to know about people like you. I think that's a beautiful sentence. It's a meaningful sentence. Says a lot. It's not you they're interested. It's finding out about people like you. One of the largest purveyors of consumer intelligence, Blue Sky, has privacy protections that sound a lot like what President Obama outlined in his speech last Friday. They put a time limit on how long they track users. They keep all files anonymous. They also limit the data available in the profiles, no financial data, no health data, no sex or religious data. It's all converted into a form of metadata, which means numbers. Numbers, of course, can be manipulated and moved and all the rest of it. Their information, however, she says, is still incredibly valuable because the data they collect and distribute isn't intended to track a single person. It's intended to help marketers find a group of people who can be coaxed into sharing a single interest, their product. In other words, the single interest that they're looking for is the likelihood of being interested in the product that this organization seeks to sell. Massive amounts of data about millions of people allows commercial interests to sort users into categories, and then marketers can tailor the category's online experience to push its members as firmly as possible in the direction of its product. No one's privacy has been violated in the sense of having any secrets revealed. It's almost just the opposite. And as she points out, and I think this is the reason I wanted to go back to this today, and that's what makes this even worse than if they were pouring into your secrets. What the end result of this whole process is that we are being manipulated in a way that makes us less individual, less unique, less capable of having secrets to begin with. In other words, we are being dehumanized. The interest in us is being reduced to pieces of raw data, which are being included or interfaced with other people's data. And the sum total is, from the perspective of from the perspective that these operations, these organizations are functioning on, we don't exist as people. We exist as beings that can be enticed or directed or sold or encouraged or manipulated or whatever other word you might think is most appropriate. In other words, the end justifies the means. And the means is reducing all of us. So in a sense, and I'm citing, I don't want to go to it right now because I don't know if I can lay my hands on it. But Justice Louis Brandeis made the comment one time. He was talking about privacy. And he said the right to be left alone is the essence of human honor and dignity. That's pretty close to a quote. I've read it a couple of times over the last 3 or 4 days. The right to be left alone is the essence of human honor and dignity. What he's basically saying is privacy is an incredible part, important part of our existence as human beings. And if we lose that, we cease to be functioning individuals. We cease to be human and we become almost automatons. And that seems to be, at least from Anna Marie Cox's perspective in this article, that seems to be the thing more than anything else that she's focusing in on. I'll be very honest with you. It also is what I focus in on. As we've talked many times, I'm not going to go into this at this point, but my whole background and educational experience has been in the liberal arts. And I've said numerous times on this program, and I mean it with very ounce being, that ultimately the real purpose of education, as I see it, is to learn the things that make us human. I don't believe the fact that we are alive and the fact that we are a breathing, moving, biological entity is what makes us human. What makes us human is what we learn about what being human means and why it is so distinct and so unique from other forms of life. And I really believe that. And that's why I wanted to go in as deeply as I have in the last couple of days into this topic, because I think the kinds of things that happen are happening to us in our society, in large part as a result of the availability of the technology. It is giving organizations and institutions the opportunity to reduce us to functioning machines. And in the process, it is, I believe, dehumanizing us. And I believe that that's a real danger, and that's the reason that I've taken on this topic in such depth over the last 10 days or so. I believe it's incredibly important. I think one of the things I've found is the range of items and issues, the range of articles and comments and concerns that people have about what's happening are legion. In other words, it's amazing how many people are concerned about this. But I think it's important to put some flesh onto the bones of that concern. I think we have to take the time to be able to understand and explain and make our case as to why this is the danger that many of us superficially think it is. She says, Anna Maria Cox says, the masters of modern spycraft have learned from the masters of marketing the science of predicting human behavior. One of the main reasons for bulk collection, one that seems less alarming on its surface, is to watch for patterns of behavior that indicate possible terrorist activity. But when an organization is sufficiently skilled at predicting human behavior, the next phase, almost inevitably, is to try to influence it. And it is our marketing folks that have mastered the strategy of affecting, predicting, and ideally, from their perspective, controlling human behavior. So all the things that we grew up believing were so important, even though we couldn't define them and we couldn't explain them, things like free will and the right to choose and freedom, I've mentioned before that one of the things that amazed me during the Bush administration during the second Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, was the rather frequent yet rather flippant way that the president used the word freedom. You know, we're extending freedom, we're protecting freedom, we're making freedom possible for other people, we're expanding our freedom, we're doing this, that, and the other. And none of it was, but when you say freedom, for many, many people, that's all you need. As long as you're for that, then you can't be bad. And the fact of the matter is, it seems to me very, very important to think about and to reflect upon what we mean by freedom. What is, you know, we are human beings. We have, I believe we have a soul and a conscience and all the rest of it. So within all of this, it seems to me freedom needs to be defined. We have let the marketers define it for us. We have basically fallen into, I believe, the trap to assume that freedom is the same thing as free choice. And that ultimately there's nothing wrong with presenting the choices and then try to influence which choice we tend to go to. And I would suggest to you that one of the things I've learned in the years that I've been reading and appreciating history is that freedom means much more than the right to choose between alternatives presented by somebody else. Freedom ought to involve, should involve, the right to have some say in the choices. And I think that's the real issue. And so, in a sense, this is what we're talking about. And again, the emphasis on the NSA and Edward Snowden and the extent to which government itself has moved so openly and so rapidly and so overwhelmingly into the field of collecting and manipulating data is scaring a lot of people. But I think the issue here is that they're learning from the best. And that's what, in large part, is driving the economic engine that we call free enterprise. And I think we need to realize this. Basically, Anna Maria Cox links the collection of bulk data with the name of George Orwell. Probably don't have to worry about federal agents knocking down doors in the middle of the night. Tyranny can be a lot more insidious than that. It can be the limitation of options, the curbing of ambitions, or the gentle nudging forward down a path you thought you chose, but you really didn't choose it at all. I think that what she's got here is a very, very powerful. I think it raises some serious questions. And the reason I wanted to return to that piece today is because it leads into what I think is a major portion of this subject, of this topic, that we have yet to really pursue in any depth. And that is the issue of the government itself, of the National Security Agency, and its collection of data. During his speech, how many times have we made reference to President Obama's speech last Friday on proposals to kind of rein in, at least in theory, the NSA? And as I mentioned yesterday, if you read the speech, one of the things that becomes very clear is that while he has some substantive and I believe significant recommendations in order to try to tone down and control what the NSA is doing, the fact of the matter is the one thing that seems to be off the table to the president is the collection of the data itself. It seems to me that Michael Hayden, in his prediction the day before the president delivered the speech, that the president's goal was not to do anything meaningful to interrupt or to regulate or minimize the NSA's access to data. Rather, it was to present a series of American people so that they would be much more comfortable with what the NSA is doing. And I think that's a very, very significant difference from reining in the NSA. This is an article that's dated January 17th, which I believe is the day after the president made his speech, about the president's speech. More specifically, about the president's opening comments in his speech, in which he went back into early American history. He was talking about surveillance, and he was talking about the long history that this nation has, as does every nation, in practicing surveillance. And specifically, he cites Paul Revere. And the president says, and this is directly from his speech, "At the dawn of our republic, a small secret surveillance committee born out of the Sons of Liberty was established in Boston. And the group's members included Paul Revere, America's early patriots." There's absolutely no question that he's right. And Petrie, in her article, Alexandra Petrie, goes to one of the best sources on Paul Revere, on the American Revolution, the origins of it, that there is, and this is material by historian David Hackett Fisher in his publication called Paul Revere's Ride. And in that, which is based on primary source materials, is the following quote from Paul Revere. "I was one of upwards of 30, chiefly mechanics, who formed ourselves into a committee for the purpose of watching the movements of the British soldiers and gaining every intelligence of the movements of the Tories. We held our meetings at the Green Dragon Tavern. We were so careful that our meetings should be kept secret that every time we met, every person swore upon the Bible that he would not discover any of our transactions except to Messrs. Hancock, Adams, Doctors Warren, Church, and one or two more." But then Fisher points out in his book that despite that emphasis on secrecy, Dr. Benjamin Church shared some of the information with Thomas Gage, who was the head of British troops in Boston, for money. We hear so much about Benedict Arnold. We hear almost nothing about Dr. Benjamin Church. So despite the emphasis on secrecy, the fact of the matter is the British knew. And if you remember, and I'm not going to go into this now, but the whole story of Paul Revere's Ride is to basically go out into the West, into Concord and Lexington, and warn Hancock and Adams and Warren and the rest of them that the British are coming and they have warrants for their arrest. In other words, they've been tipped off as to who the leaders of this operation are, and they're after them. So these people are wanted, and Paul Revere is riding out to warn them. President Obama makes that as part of the introduction to his speech. And Alexander Petrie focuses on that, and I think advisedly, and also points out that, indeed, during the Civil War, the issue of balloon reconnaissance, that people used to use balloons, surveillance balloons. And what they would do at night is they would report by counting they would count the campfires, and you could pretty well tell where the enemy was by the number of campfires. The point that she makes in her article, and I think it's the point that needs to be made about all of this, is that there's one major difference between the president's citation or use of Paul Revere as background for a speech that he's giving on surveillance, the collection of information. And that is Paul Revere and his group, his committee, meeting at the Green Dragon Tavern do not represent the government spying on people. They represent the people trying to gain insight and information into what the government is doing, in this case, British troops. So I would suggest to you that there's a major difference here. And there's absolutely no question, and I think she points this out in her article, that technology was making it possible to improve surveillance, as you can see it with the Paul Revere group, and then you can see it during the Civil War with the balloon surveillance. And then she concludes her article, and I don't want to paraphrase this because I don't want to misinterpret what she says, and I want to make sure that I share with you exactly what her point is. She said, "True, the struggle to balance the power of the tools of surveillance and the rights of the people observed, as well as the difficulty of keeping sensitive information out of the wrong hands, are problems as old as this nation. But the examples don't shed much light on today's challenges. The balance is a lot trickier to strike now because the tools are so much more powerful and the apparatus so much more complex. Any intelligence you can share at the Green Dragon Tavern clearly doesn't require a supercomputer. You can tell if someone's watching you in a balloon made of fine silk, or if Paul Revere is lingering outside your door. Both of these were cases of private individuals, either under their own steam or after some wangling on the government payroll, watching enemy armies. If only it were that simple." Because the program that the president's speech was going to address were programs that involve government's collection of information, government's conducting of surveillance on its own citizenry. I think that this is a perspective that almost is necessary in order to say that here at the Virtual Center we kind of covered the topic. Not to do this, it seems to me, leaves everything in limbo. We have talked about the collection of data, and we have talked about the technology to do it. We have talked about the assumptions that drive that technology. We have even talked about, very briefly, about the dreams of the people that are engaged in the collection and manipulation of this kind of data. And I think the one thing we've made the point is that while we tend to focus on government, The fact of the matter is, they are learning from pros. Government is learning from pros. And the pros are the marketers who have recognized the ability to collect and manipulate data, and now have the technology which makes the manipulation and making sense of that data so much more sophisticated than it ever was before, that indeed it is infringing on what makes human beings human. Our concerns are well placed. But the fact of the matter is, we live in a republic. We do not live in a dictatorship. We do not live in a political environment where whatever government must do in order to fulfill its objectives is okay. Theoretically, there needs to be a sense of accountability and responsibility between what government is doing and the citizens of this nation. And it seems to me that opens a series of considerations, or presents a series of serious considerations, which I believe all of us would be well put to think about. I'm inclined, as I think about this, to think about James Madison. Not only that, but I'm also inclined to reflect upon those who will use and cite James Madison in order to justify the right to limit government's power. James Madison was the principal architect of a constitutional system that was based on the principle of limited government. And the basic elements of those limitations revolved around the role of the citizens at large in the political process. That's what defines a republic. Theoretically, what we're talking about here are the differences between a government over the people and a government that reflects and represents the best interests and the priorities of the people. And so it seems to me that when we get into this issue of the collection of data and the manipulation of data with the idea that it's going to affect behavior, we have to consider very seriously what the founders wanted and what the founders believed about the relationship between government and their own citizens. Jeffrey Rosen in the New York Times discussed this very matter in relationship to James Madison in an article which he called Madison's Privacy Blind Spot. And basically what he's suggesting, and I think this is very significant, is the degree to which, depending on what people's priorities are, they will dip into the founders and they will cherry pick information about the founders in such a way that the founders will end up saying what these people want them to say. There's no question, and that we've used this, looked at this many times here, is that more and more a lot of these issues are being justified in part by going back in history and going back to the founders. But the difference is, are we trying to find out and figure out and conclude what the founders really wanted? Or are we inclined more to cherry pick the founders in order to make them say exactly what we want them to say? That difference is an incredibly important one. Last month, you may have read, I remember, a decision by Judge Richard Leon in New York, in which he raised serious questions about the constitutionality of the National Security Agency's phone data collection program. And he raised a red flag. And he used some incredible language to talk about the potential damage to individual privacy that the day-to-day operations of the NSA were having on the American people. In that decision, Judge Leon, L-E-O-N, Richard Leon, also cited James Madison. And he said in that decision, James Madison, who cautioned us to beware of the abridgment of freedom of the people by gradual and silent encroachments by those in power, would be aghast at what the NSA is doing. The quote again, James Madison cautioned us to beware of the abridgment of freedom of the people by gradual, silent encroachments by those in power. Thus, libertarians claim Madison as that figure who, more than anyone else during the period of the founders, subscribed to the priorities of modern libertarianism. And of course, their evidence is the emphasis that Madison places on liberty in so many of the Federalist Papers that he wrote. His emphasis is on individual liberty. And his concern is the threats to individual liberty. But as we saw in Federalist number 10, Madison saw the greatest threat to individual liberty not coming from the top, but coming from the bottom, namely what he called the majority faction. And so basically what we're dealing with is the fact that Judge Leon goes to Madison. President Obama goes to Madison. Justice Anton Scalia invoked, and this is from Jeffrey Rosen's article, Justice Antonin Scalia invoked Madison last spring in his dissent on a Supreme Court opinion upholding the government's right to collect DNA swabs from suspects. Again, in his dissent, Scalia makes reference to Madison. So Rosen's whole point is to try to clarify exactly what Madison does and what Madison does not contribute to this debate about freedom and privacy from government supervision. And understandably, and we're rapidly approaching the top of our first hour here, so I'll make this quick. Understandably, he goes to Federalist number 10 and points out, and this is a direct quote, Madison believed that the preservation of people's different and unequal faculties of acquiring property was the first object of government. He's exactly right. That is in Federalist number 10. That protecting the different and unequal faculties for acquiring property is, Madison said, the first object of government. But Rosen's point is that Madison also believed that a too powerful government could undermine that goal. He was more concerned about legislative abuse of power and long-term about the possibility of executive abuse of power than he was concerned about any threat to liberty being posed by the private sector, by commerce, by merchants, by the economy, by free enterprise. So Madison's focus naturally was within the framework of government itself. And that then explains the title of this article, Madison's Privacy Blind Spot. There was no reason in the world why Madison should raise a flag about the threat to individual freedom and privacy posed by corporations or posed by commercial interests or financial interests. Consequently, he never considered it. His major concern was the threat to freedom posed by the organization of something he referred to as the majority faction, the organization of the poor, and the threats that it would have to the different and unequal faculties of acquiring property. We have reached the top of our hour. Let's pause and take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll complete our final hour here this week at the Virtual Center. Where I want to go in this next hour is to the whole issue of the so-called security state. The idea of the collection of data in order to keep the nation secure. First, a break. This is Bill O'Brien. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. After a 5-minute break, we'll be right back. This is Bill O'Brien back with you for our second hour here at the Virtual Center. I have to make a comment about that music. It sounds so 18th century. It sounds so French, I guess.
Spanish.
Anyway, Spanish?
Yeah.
Sounded French. Thanks, Bob. I wish that was the first time I'd been wrong.
Yeah, that was some classical guitar. I thought a little something different would be nice on a snowy day like this.
Thank you. I appreciated it very much. We are into our second hour here on this cold, snowy Wednesday here in the mountains of Appalachia. And I want to, first of all, thank you. If you're just joining us, welcome to the program, and thanking you for your willingness to give us some of your valuable time. If you've been with us since through the first hour, then I especially want to thank you, because you've chosen to stay with us after an hour, and that kind of says that there must be something we're doing that you're finding worthwhile and valuable, and I hope that that's true. That's really what we're about. I don't know that there's anything other than that I could claim any kind of expertise or ability to deliver. But if I can make the program worthwhile to you, then I feel like it's well worth the effort that goes into it. We would love to hear from you and hear your reactions to some of this very, very important material focusing on the issue of privacy and freedom and all the rest of it. Very, very, I think, important stuff. Our phone number is area code 304-658-3333. 304-658-3333. My personal email address, if you'd like to make a comment to me individually, then please feel free to do that. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906 at gmail.com. We were, at the end of our first hour, we were looking at an article that appeared in the New York Times on the 18th of January, written by Jeffrey Rosen, and it was entitled Madison's Privacy Blind Spot. And basically what Rosen clearly sets out to do is look very, very carefully at James Madison's concerns about an overbearing state, about the power of an overbearing federal government. And at the same time recognizing that Madison was the architect of this system. And Madison recognized the need to create a much stronger central government than the central government that existed under the Articles of Confederation. But Rosen's point was that Madison is kind of straddling two concerns here. He sees the need to strengthen the central government, but he also recognizes the tendency, as he puts it at the very beginning of his article, the tendency to abridge the freedom of the people by gradual and silent encroachment by those in power. He recognizes the human tendency to seek to enhance power. And in the people serving in government, this directly threatens the freedom of the people. And of course, what Rosen is talking about here as being Madison's blind spot is that while he's concerned about the freedom of the people, his concerns are focused only in one direction. There's no reason in the world for Madison to contemplate concern about what Rosen refers to as an unregulated commercial power. He makes the point, very, very solid point, that when the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution in 1791, and we must remember that Madison, throughout the entire Constitutional Convention, opposed the need for a Bill of Rights. But then at the 11th hour, he became an advocate for a Bill of Rights. And there are a number of different explanations or interpretations as to what the real reasons for Madison's switch was. There's absolutely no question that those opposed to the Constitution were looking at the idea of a second constitutional convention for the purposes of considering amendments as a way to get the entire constitutional structure back on the table. There's no question, and I subscribe to this, that Madison's principal reasons for giving in on the idea of a Bill of Rights were not concerns about the freedom of the people nearly as much as a concern that the power of the government that he created and that the Constitutional Convention had approved would be in jeopardy if there was ever a second convention. The only way to undercut the move towards a second convention was to endorse the addition of amendments to the Constitution. And it is my sense that Madison's principal objective then was not so much to look out for the freedoms of the people as much as it was to protect the constitutional structure that had been created at Philadelphia. Madison makes the point in his letters that there's no intent on the part of anybody to jeopardize free speech or freedom of assembly or the right to a free press or anything, a jury trial or anything else. That's really not what the Constitution is about, Madison said. So I think Mr. Rosen has a few things to consider about Madison as well. Well, just as Judge Leon raised serious questions about the NSA's surveillance program, Judge William Pauley, federal district judge in New York, reached the exact opposite conclusion when he upheld the NSA spying program by noting that the founders approved of secrecy. And then this goes all the way back and to the Revolutionary period and the whole idea of the writs of assistance, which the British troops used to practice in their occupation of Boston, where they would get a search warrant, what we would call today a search warrant. These writs of assistance would give them the opportunity to go into private homes and search for contraband. And the very famous argument by an attorney, James Otis, against the writs of assistance. This was in 1761. This was 15 years before the Declaration of Independence. About the power of these military officers to violate the sanctity and the privacy of people's homes. And so basically, this whole idea of secrecy and privacy is being pursued. And Rosen is especially looking at the position of James Madison on this. And I mentioned earlier, this is the article that I was referring to earlier when Justice Louis Brandeis made the point that the right to be let alone is tantamount to human honor and dignity. So basically, Rosen's conclusion about Madison was concerned about the threats to individual freedom coming from the top, from government. He never really considered the threats that could come from the private sector. I don't know that that's a fair criticism, because I don't know that there's any reason in the world why Madison would look in that direction. But I think the fact that Madison raised these questions and was fully aware of the dangers of strengthening the central government on the one hand without going so far that you jeopardize the freedom of the nation's own people on the other, I think is a very significant place to go. And I think the fact that Rosen has looked at some of the primary sources here is admirable. We have about 40 minutes to go in today's program. And I want to bring this whole issue of the collection of data, the collection of personal information, and the threats to privacy to a conclusion by sharing with you an absolutely incredible article by Peter Ludlow that appeared not too long ago in the series the New York Times calls The Stone, which is about philosophy. Peter Ludlow is a professor of philosophy at Northwestern University. And he writes on a facet of this topic that we really haven't gone into yet. And it's the issue of fear and the extent to which fear plays a significant role not only in government's quest for data, for information, but also in people's willingness to surrender it. if you'll bear with me, I'm going to let Peter Ludlow speak an awful lot for himself here, because I think given the background that we have on this topic, I think many of the things that he says are going to hit the mark. He opens his article by citing Bertrand Russell, the very famous British philosopher, and cites Bertrand Russell's comment as World War II was drawing to a close, that, quote, neither a man nor a crowd nor a nation can be trusted to act humanely or to think sanely under the fear, unquote. In other words, the mere existence of fear has a direct influence on how individuals behave, how crowds behave, how nations behave. And while a lot of this is generally related to authoritarian states, Ludlow points out that democracies as well use fear to exert control over the populace and to consolidate power. The one perspective that I don't think we've really looked seriously at during this entire discussion now that's gone on for 3 or 4 days here at the Virtual Center is the idea of national consolidation power in order to protect the nation. More specifically, the extent to which the threat to the nation's security is real, the extent to which the threat to the nation's security becomes the justification for the consolidation of power in the hands of government, the extent to which threats to the security of the nation justify not only the NSA's actions in the collection of individual information and data, but also people's willingness to concede that right to the NSA. I would suggest to you this might be as great a threat to the issues that we've been talking about as the threat to the individuality of human beings. Ludlow points out that today, democracies founded on the principles of liberty and the common good frequently take the path that's usually taken by authoritarian states. They don't work to minimize fear. They use fear to exert control over the populace and to serve government's principal aim of consolidating power. Philosophers, he points out, have long noted the utility of fear to the state. The utility of fear. The use of fear to secure power. Machiavelli argued that a good leader should induce fear in the people in order to control the masses. Hobbes, in his Leviathan, argued that fear effectively motivates the creation of a social contract in which citizens are willing to cede their freedoms to the sovereign. There's no way in the world that the people in Thomas Hobbes's State of Nature would be willing to concede all of their power to the sovereign, to the Leviathan, unless they were afraid of anything less than that. Fear is what makes the social contract as defined by Thomas Hobbes meaningful. The people understandably want to be safe from harm, Ludlow says. The ruler imposes security and order in exchange for the surrender of certain public freedoms. As Hobbes saw it, there was no other way. Humans, left without a strong sovereign leader controlling their actions, would degenerate into mob rule. It's the fear of this state of nature, of the sovereign, but of the world without the order that the sovereign can impose, that leads us to enter into the social contract and be willing to surrender our freedoms in the process. Obviously, Hobbes is not that popular. He's not, Ludlow points out, he's not that popular among philosophers either. And in fact, we know, and of course the United States of America is the classic example of this, we know that democratic states can flourish without an absolute leader or ruler. In the United States, while we've had periods when the whole issue of individual freedom has come, has been on the table and has come into question, the fact of the matter is the history of the United States, for all practical purposes, has been the history of a republic that has not been under the power of an all-powerful sovereign. So I guess we could say that the history of the United States does not reflect all that much of Thomas Hobbes until 9/11. Back to Ludlow. Since 9/11, leaders of both political parties in the United States have sought to consolidate power by leaning not just on the danger of a terrorist attack, but on the fact that the possible perpetrators of that attack are frightening individuals who are not like us. Before a joint session of Congress in 2001, quote, "They hate our freedoms, our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, our freedom to vote and assemble and disagree with each other." President Obama, in fact, brought the enemy even closer to home than that, arguing in a speech delivered to the National Defense University, quote, "We face a threat from radicalized individuals here in the United States, radicalized individuals who are deranged or alienated individuals. Often they are U.S. citizens or legal residents in the United States." So it's not comforting at all to say we seem to have faced the greatest threat of authoritarian rule on the part of government in response to 9/11 under the tutelage of George W. Bush, but it became less so under Obama. In effect, in some ways, it's becoming even more of a threat under President Obama. And Ludlow points out that even Eric Prince, founder of the military contractor Blackwater Worldwide, thinks that the security state in America has gone too far in response to 9/11. This is a quote from Ludlow's article. "The Bush fear peddling is usually considered more extreme, but is it? The Obama formulation puts the radicalized individuals within our midst. They could be American citizens or legal residents. And the subtext is, if we want to catch them, we need to start looking within. The other is among us. The pretext for the surveillance state is thus established. This is frightening. And one of the things that I did want to make reference to before we move on is Ludlow's point from the Obama speech that the terrorists we face are frightening individuals who are not like us. Do you remember, well, I'm dating myself, I remember, during World War II. And of course, because of the fact that I was teaching history, I went back and did a lot of this research anyway. But one of the most striking things about World War II and the publicity, the public opinion side of marshaling the nation in order to fight World War II, as well as World War I, was to note the media's portrayal in World War I of Germans and in World War II of Japanese. I can remember as a young kid going to, we used to love war movies. And I can remember going to see war movies about World War II, and many of them appear on television now, the old black and white movies in the Pacific. And I can remember, as you know, when I was 7, 8 years old, being struck by the fact that the Japanese never fought fair. They always hid in trees. They were always hiding up in palm trees. And it seemed like they were animals, and they were cruel and ruthless, and they had no souls and no compassion. And they may have walked and talked like humans, but they really weren't. And some of the cartoon portrayals of the Germans during World War II is all part of the Creel Commission's effort to sell the legitimacy of World War I to the people of America by portraying Germans as some sort of animals. And the same thing was done in World War II. And now we're seeing the threat of terrorism in the world today being taken up by people who are not like us. They are people who reside in caves in Pakistan. And in other hideouts in the Middle East. They have no conscience, they have no souls, they have no compassion. And it ultimately becomes an us versus them struggle. Consequently, we look at the revelations of Edward Snowden and the concerns of Eric Prince of Blackwater, and you begin to wonder whether, in fact, we are allowing this collection of information and data, not only by the private sector, but the fact that the NSA is demanding access to this data. We have seen all sorts of evidence to suggest that corporations like Verizon and AT&T were asked by government to collect this kind of data and to log phone calls and send the data, make the data available to the NSA. So what we're beginning to see very clearly is the idea of what Ludlow in his article refers to as a new surveillance state. And I think it's very significant that if you look at President Obama's speech Friday, he did nothing to relieve concerns about the idea of a surveillance state. Eric Prince, the contractor who founded Blackwater, makes the point that the kind of security measures that we're taking today against terrorism give us what he calls, quote, the illusion of security rather than the real thing. He calls it security theater. Or, as Ludlow says, maybe it would be better called the theater of fear. The TSA at airport screenings. And Ludlow points out that the experts, security experts, are very clear that these procedures at airports are not making us safe. That they are, for all practical purposes, more than anything else, theater. The question is whether the theater is supposed to make us, or whether, in fact, it's intended to remind us that we are not safe. One of the more noted security experts, Bruce Schneier, suggests that the real issue is the latter. In other words, that most of the security measures that we are taking against terrorists are not intended to make us safer. They're more intended to remind us of how much danger we are in. They are not relieving fear. They are exacerbating fear. As an aside, let me say that, you know, as I go through this material, I've been through it a couple of times, obviously, in preparation for today, but as I get into it again, I keep thinking to myself, this makes the whole idea of the collection of data and the idea of metadata and all of that stuff we talk about the manipulation of data in order to sell books and sell tablets and iPads and all this other stuff, seem rather minor, but in fact it's all part of the same piece. If you know what I mean, that's the scary part. So here's a quote from Ludlow, and I've bracketed this and pointed out that this seems to be a key statement. By sowing mistrust, by stripping us of our privacy, and in many cases our dignity, by taking away our rights, by subjecting us to arbitrary and irrational rules, by constantly reminding us that this is the only thing between us and death at the hands of terrorists, the TSA and other organizations like it are sowing fear. And by doing that, Ludlow believes they're really playing directly into the hands of the terrorists. Because, Ludlow points out, terrorists are not into crashing planes, and their goal is not to crash planes or kill people necessarily. The goal of terrorism is terror. They can only do so much. The rest of it is in our ballpark, so to speak. They can cause some terror, but it's our reaction to the terrorism they create that determines whether or not they are ultimately successful. That we allow, this is a quote from Ludlow, that we allow governments to do these things to us, to effectively do the terrorist job for them, is the greatest harm of all. And Ludlow cites Norwegian philosopher Lars Svensson, who has written a book called A Philosophy of Fear. And in that book, Svensson makes the point that Thomas Hobbes anticipated the need for the sovereign to manipulate fear. The state, Svensson writes, this is a quote, has to convince people that certain things should be feared rather than other things. Since the people will not, just like that, fear what is appropriate from the point of view of the state. Hobbes points out that this can necessitate a certain amount of staging by the state, which magnifies certain threats and diminishes others. And then Svensson concludes, we are conditioned to fear persons in caves in Pakistan, but not fatal industrial accidents or work-related deaths of thousands of Americans every year. And then Ludlow goes to make his point to the Boston massacre, the Boston Marathon bombing this past April 15th. And I remember this so well. The Boston Police Department imposed martial law on the city of Boston, seized control of people's homes, and used them as command posts in an effort to apprehend the bombers. And of course, the bombing was terrible. 3 people died, 260 people injured, some very, very seriously. But Ludlow points out, 2 days later, a giant explosion at a fertilizer plant in Texas killed 14 people and injured more than 160. I remember this. I don't know if you do. But the nation, Ludlow points out, the nation held its breath. Could this have been terrorists? What we learned was that the fertilizer explosion was probably an accident caused by stored ammonium nitrate. The result was that once we realized it was an accident, we never heard about that explosion again. And then Ludlow points out that according to the U.S. Congressional Research Office, thousands of industrial facilities across the country risk the same kind of harm or such an explosion to nearby people. And then Ludlow refers to the water situation in West Virginia that we've already talked so much about in the Elk River. Few, if any, of the Sunday talk shows the first weekend discussed the matter. But imagine what would have happened if terrorists had poisoned the water of 300,000 Americans. The point is that we are being programmed to respond and not others. And all of it leads to the strengthening of what Ludlow calls the security state. He includes some data as an example. This is 2012 Bureau of Labor Statistics. 4,383 workers were killed on the job in 2012. Basically, what Ludlow points out is that effectively means 4,383 people were killed on the job last year. That effectively means that we suffer 9/11 again every single year in terms of workplace fatalities. The AFL-CIO estimates that 50,000 people die every year from occupational diseases, as well as thousands of workers being permanently disabled. And this is his conclusion. In total, 54,000 Americans die every year due to work-related illnesses and accidents. That's the equivalent of 148 deaths a day. In terms of fatalities, it means a Boston Marathon bombing every half hour of every single day. But while we spend $7 billion a year on the TSA's National Security Theater in order to employ 58,000 TSA employees whose job is to make sure that we're not carrying too much toothpaste or too much shampoo onto airplanes, the budget for the Occupational and Safety and Health Administration is under $6 million a year. Basically, that suggests something very significant. It suggests that our attention is being directed to certain threats, but not to others. And of course, he raises serious questions about whether what we're doing to combat terrorism is actually making us safer or actually breeding more terrorists. And I think that's a significant factor. He makes the comment, I want to quote this because he makes a comment about the president's use of drones. He said that the whole idea of drones arises from what he calls Hobbesian assumption about society, that the sovereign enlisted to impose order is above the law. The sovereign is free to do whatever is in his power to impose order. If the and this is very significant, if the United States is to be in charge of providing order for the world, then its sovereign has to be above the law. Here, Ludlow says, lie the roots of so-called American exceptionalism. Not only are we collecting data and information on our own people because the threat has become, is internal, and we need to root it out. But also the United States has claimed the right to be the focus of security for the entire world. Consequently, that kind of responsibility cannot come with imposed limits on the power of the sovereign, on the power of the state. It has to be able to do whatever it feels it needs to do in order to fulfill its objectives. Svensson, in his book, describes this situation as follows. The social contract is absolutely binding on all citizens, but the sovereign himself is not subject to the contract that he undertakes to guarantee. Similarly, the U.S. is conceived as being the guarantor of a civilized world, as the country that can maintain moral order. But that stands outside this order. Fear is driving the United States to believe it is above the law. And there's a quote here from somebody that I had to look twice to make sure. This is a quote from former Attorney General John Ashcroft, if you remember him. And he raised a red flag in 2001, and some of you may remember when he was in the hospital and President Bush and Dick Cheney visited him in his hotel room in order to get his signature on documents needed to pursue the war on terrorism after the 9/11 attack. Ashcroft, in December of 2001, said the following: "To those who scare peace-loving people with phantoms of lost liberty, my message is this: your tactics only aid terrorists, for they erode our national unity and diminish our resolve. They give ammunition to America's enemies and pause to America's friends." And then Svensson moves from Ashcroft's quote to consideration of philosopher Carl Schmitt, who was a major defender of Adolf Hitler's killings of his political enemies. And he points out that Schmidt argued that national security was critical and that individual liberty always had to be subjugated to safety. And Svensson writes the following: a political act consists in maintaining one's own existence and destroying those that threaten it. And there is little room for overcoming conflicts via discussion. Such political action is the sole right of the state. And in order to maintain itself, the state must also eliminate all enemies within. That is, all those who do not fit into a homogeneous unity. Every genuine political theory, according to Schmidt, must assume that man is evil, that man is a dangerous being. It is here, in the fear of what humans can do to each other, that the state finds the justification of its own existence. The ability of the state to protect one is the argument for submitting to it. Fear is primal human state, is a primal human state. And that's the basic message. We have 6 or 7 minutes left in our program. I've been struck in recent days by the extensive coverage being given to Russia's efforts to promise and to produce safety and security for athletes at the upcoming Olympics in Sochi. And there is some indication today that the Russians have actually come to the United States in search of security equipment, things that they can use to produce safety. You may recall that 2 nights ago, the President Obama, called Putin and offered America's help. There's no way that the pride of Putin is going to let him invite people over there to assist the Russians as they try to make the Olympics secure. Russian pride probably will not permit that. But in terms of requesting surveillance equipment and things, that's a different story, and it looks like that's happening. But what particularly strikes me are the pictures of these so-called black widows, these potential suicide bombers that the Russians, there are 5 of them, that the Russians can't find. Are reporting that they believe one of them is already in Sochi. And what is this doing? There's no question that with the Olympics not scheduled to begin until February 7th, it's becoming clear to me that there's a serious possibility that we may start to see people pulling out of the Olympics because the fear factor has become so real. And there's a general conclusion that the Russians are not nearly as adept as we are in providing safety for anything this big, the Olympics. Please don't get the sense that I personally subscribe to all of this, or even a lot of it. The reason I close our programs this week with this particular consideration of the use of fear is that it is historically valid. Nations have done it. We have done it. There's absolutely no question that if you study World War I and World War II and look at some of the strategies taken in order to protect the nation and some of the things we did. Think of the incarceration of Japanese Americans in concentration camps in World War II and the extent to which the Supreme Court endorsed it. There's absolutely no question the history of this nation from a constitutional perspective suggests that individual rights and liberties always take a backseat to security at times when the nation feels threatened. I can remember very well in the early 70s when the Nixon administration was actively endorsing the idea of stirring up something overseas in order to take public focus away from Watergate. And there are quotes on these tapes, Nixon tapes, to suggest that he recognized that there's nothing that works as well to pull people together and get them all on the same page as when people feel that the nation is threatened. Historically, I've seen it over and over and over again. Obviously, like most of you, I never lived through anything like 9/11 either. And there's absolutely no question that some of the response to 9/11 was not only to be anticipated, it was unexpected. It was in many ways warranted. But given the collection of private information and the sacrificing of individual privacy that we are experiencing, and given the extent to which the government is not above going to private corporations who have been collecting this kind of data for a long time and demanding access to it under the name of protecting the security of the nation against terrorism, and then given the fact that we have now transferred the terrorists from caves in Pakistan to the streets of New York and Minneapolis and the rest of these places. Consequently, we need to start collecting data and information on our own people in order to guarantee the security. There is absolutely no question that we may be in the midst of something that we need to be aware of if we're ever going to get a handle on it. And that's the purpose for these programs. That's my purpose for introducing this here at the Virtual Center. Most people, most citizens believe that the Constitution is about rights. It's not, but most people believe it is. But if indeed people believe that, then they need to recognize that their rights are clearly at issue in the quest for security and the degree to which fear is driving that quest. I am not saying that the fear is not warranted. I am not saying that terrorism is not something to be worried about. But I am one who subscribes to the idea that more terrorism breeds not an end to terrorism, but more terrorism. And I would suggest to you that the idea of tit for tat in this kind of a situation is probably not the best way to go. It's 59 minutes after the hour. In fact, it is the top of the hour. We are at the end of our program today. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful week. Be safe, keep warm, and we'll be back together next Monday. This is Bill O'Brien for the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Thank you.